All right, so are we ready to dive into another case? This time, we're heading straight into the heart of the 1980s, California to be exact. Imagine a city living under a shadow, everyone on edge because brutal crimes kept happening. And the scariest part, they seemed totally random. This is the story of the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. But we're not just looking at what he did, we're trying to understand why.
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? It's the thing that's had criminologists and psychologists scratching their heads for years. How does someone become capable of such awful things? It's rarely just one thing, though, right? It's usually this whole mix of nature and nurture. To really get a grip on Richard Ramirez, we got to go back to the beginning, El Paso, Texas, his childhood.
And his childhood, it wasn't exactly sunshine and roses, was it? What I'm getting from the research you've shared is that Ramirez dealt with a lot of trauma, even as a really young kid.
Oh, absolutely. The abuse from his father was constant. Then you add in exposure to drugs at a super young age. And, well, you can't forget about the influence of his cousin, Miguel, but everyone called him Mike. Mike Vallis, a Vietnam War vet. Imagine this. Mike would brag to young Richard about the horrible things he did during the war, and it gets worse, he'd show Richard photos, really graphic ones, of women being tortured.
Man, that's just messed up. For anyone to see, let alone a child, how does something like that affect a kid long term?
Well, seeing that much violence, that young, it's damaging. It really can desensitize a kid to it, almost makes it seem normal. Research on childhood trauma suggests that it can really mess with a child's emotional development, increases the risk of them becoming violent themselves later on. And for Ramirez, it gets even more intense.
We're talking about the murder, right? Mike's wife. The one Ramirez saw with his own eyes as a teenager.
That's the one. Put yourself in his shoes for a second. 13 years old, seeing something that traumatic, and within his own family, no less. It's impossible to really know how much something like that can impact the young mind. Some experts believe that seeing something that violent firsthand, especially at that age, can be a major turning point. It can push someone down a path of criminal behavior, often violent behavior.
That's like a perfect storm, isn't it? You can see how those experiences early on could have sent him down a dark path. But how does a troubled kid from Texas become the infamous Night Stalker that instilled fear in California?
It's not like he jumped straight to murder. Like a lot of criminals, there's a pattern, an escalation. We see him getting into trouble with the law, petty theft, drugs. But his first murder that we know of, that was in 1984. And this was years before he became the Night Stalker. But it's chilling. It's like a sneak peek of the brutality that was to come. This 9-year-old girl, Mei Lung, he lured her to the basement of his apartment building in San Francisco. What happened to her is just awful. And the fact that it took so long for anyone to connect him to that crime, it's disturbing.
It's like even before he was known as the Night Stalker, he was already doing terrible things. They just flew under the radar for a while. Nobody connected the dots. Like he was almost practicing, getting bolder in the
It's
shadows.
a scary thought for sure. And that period before he was on everyone's radar, before the Night Stalker name came about, that's crucial for understanding how his crimes escalated. He went from small-time stuff to something truly sinister. And it's like each thing he did fueled his darkness.
And then, summer of 1985, Los Angeles became his hunting ground.
What really freaked people out that summer, what made '85 so scary for LA, was how random it all seemed. He wasn't like some serial killers who target a certain type. Ramirez, he went after men, women, young, old. Didn't seem to matter to him.
So it's like he wasn't looking for one specific kind of person, more like any chance to cause pain to scare people, that was enough.
Yeah, exactly. You just never knew. And that made it so much worse. Anyone could be next. It wasn't even just about the murders themselves. It was the fear, turning everyday life in LA into a nightmare. And to make it even scarier, Ramirez started leaving his calling card.
Right, the satanic stuff. It's like something out of a movie, a serial killer leaving dark symbols behind. What's that all about?
You've hit on something important about the whole Ramirez case. It captured people's imaginations. Fact, fiction, it all kind of blurred together. I mean, the symbols themselves, they weren't always the same. Sometimes it's pentagrams, other times inverted crosses. People still debate what they really meant to Ramirez, but they definitely ramped up the fear, made the Night Stalker seem even more terrifying.
Like he was using that fear on purpose, playing it up. Those symbols, it was like he wanted to be seen as even more menacing, almost supernatural.
Exactly. And it plays into that whole fascination people have with the dark side, with evil. Ramirez knew that, might have even wanted the attention it brought. He wasn't just a murderer. He was like a boogeyman coming out of nowhere. But as scary as the randomness was, it also made things harder for the people trying to catch him.
Because how do you track someone when there's no pattern? It's like trying to grab onto smoke.
It was a tough investigation, no doubt. And the technology back then, It wasn't what it is now. DNA profiling, that wasn't really a thing yet. So Detectives Salerno and Carrillo, they were the lead guys on the case. They relied on witnesses, fingerprints, good old-fashioned detective work.
Yeah.
But the crimes were so brutal, so much to sift through. It was a massive undertaking.
You mentioned earlier that Ramirez, he wasn't content with just killing. There was torture too, right? And I think that's important. These weren't quick deaths. He wanted to inflict pain. Like that attack on Maria Hernandez, she was shot in the face, survived that, and then he killed her roommate.
And as awful as that is, the Hernandez case, that's just one of many. It shows you how horrific his crimes were. The murder of Jenny Vinkow, an elderly woman stabbed to death in her own home. The Zazares, Maxine and her husband Richard, shot in their sleep. Then he mutilated Maxine's body. He even took her eyes. This wasn't just murder, it was pure cruelty. And every new crime, every detail that came out, it just pushed L.A. further into that state of terror.
You know, those details about the Zazares, they're really disturbing. Does your research say anything about what would cause someone to do that, the mutilation?
It's a question that both fascinates and horrifies, doesn't it? In cases like Ramirez, it seems like the killer is trying to have complete control over their victims, even after death. Taking something from them, like their eyes, it's like a sick trophy, a symbol of power.
It's a chilling thought. But we can't ignore it, can we? It's part of understanding how depraved Ramirez was, the fear he created.
You're right. To leave that out, it wouldn't be the whole story. It would be downplaying what those victims went through.
Yeah.
We got to face the brutality if we want to even try to understand the man behind it.
So we have a city on edge, a killer on the loose, and a police force desperate to catch him. What finally cracks the case open? Was it those satanic symbols?
You know, as much as those symbols fueled the fear in the theories, they weren't what led to Ramirez's capture. What really broke things open, as it often does in these cases, was a few different things, some big, some small. And one of those crucial pieces, probably the most unexpected, was a 13-year-old boy and his memory.
Okay, now this is where the story takes a turn. We got to talk about James Romero III. 13 years old, it's hard to imagine someone that young being so important in a case like this.
See, it was August of '85, not long after the Zazares were attacked. Ramirez is driving around a stolen car in this neighborhood in East L.A. James Romero III, just a teenager, he sees Ramirez hanging around outside his house.
Man, just hanging around outside his house. That's got to be one of the most unsettling details of this whole case. Could have been anyone's house, any kid.
Exactly. But James, he did something amazing, paid attention. He memorized everything he could about the car, the make, the model, even some of the license plate. Tells his dad, and his dad, he calls the cops.
Talk about being in the right place at the right time, or I guess, wrong place. But the bravery, the awareness, this kid, he changes everything.
He did. It was the break they needed. They found the car a few days later, abandoned. And inside, Ramirez's fingerprints. They already had his name on file from a past arrest, but now it clicked. They finally connected him to the Night Stalker. His face, the mugshot, it was everywhere. Newspapers, TV, wanted posters. The hunter was now the hunted.
I wonder what that was like for Ramirez. Going from this phantom, this unseen terror, to suddenly, boom, his face is everywhere. Everyone knows what he looked like, and they're all looking for him.
It's interesting, right? It's like he wanted the notoriety, the attention. Leaving those symbols behind, it was all part of it, but then it backfires. You want the fame, but maybe not like that. It shows you this guy, he was narcissistic, needed the recognition, even if it was bad, but it also shows you how quickly it can all fall apart. Once he wasn't anonymous anymore, he was just another face in the crowd. Only his face meant you were in trouble.
He had to know, though. He must have felt the walls closing in. Did he at least try to run?
He did. Tried to make a break for it, got on a bus, went to Arizona, figured he could outrun the cops, outrun his past.
Yeah.
But you can't outrun who you are, can you? And for Ramirez, that reckoning, it came in a way nobody expected.
This is the part of the story that always gets me. It's scary and exciting all at once. The capture? How did it happen?
Picture this. August 31st, 1985. Ramirez is back in L.A. The escape to Arizona didn't pan out. He walks into a store, a convenience store. Just another guy, right? But then someone recognizes him. Then someone else. All of a sudden, he's surrounded. These people, regular people who'd been terrified for months, they knew his face from the news. And they weren't letting him get away.
It's almost poetic, in a way. The guy who terrorized the city, who slipped through the police's fingers for so long, he gets taken down by a group of everyday citizens.
It's powerful, isn't it?
Yeah.
All that anger, all that fear, it just boils over. They chased him down the street, wouldn't let him go until the cops showed up. A citizen's arrest, plain and simple. And the Night Stalker, he was finally caught.
LA could finally breathe again. But the story doesn't end there, does it? What happened after they caught him?
Oh, the trial, that was a whole other spectacle. Everyone was glued to it. This guy, he'd haunted their lives, and now they wanted to see what would happen to him. Ramirez, he ate it up. The attention, he'd act up in court, to cause a stir. In the end, though, he was convicted on 43 charges, 13 murders, sentenced to death. He died years later, 2013, on death row. Cancer.
But even now, even though he's gone, there's still this unsettling feeling, like we're still trying to make sense of it. How could someone like Richard Ramirez even exist? The nature versus nurture question, that awful childhood, those random attacks, the way he seemed to be, well, evil. It's disturbing.
And that's the power of a deep dive like this, right? We can look at the facts, try to figure out why he did what he did, the psychology of it all. But some questions, they just don't have easy answers. Was it his upbringing? Was he born bad? Or was it this awful combination of both?
A question without an answer. And that's where the real value is, I think. Not in having all the answers, but in making people think, making them confront these dark parts of human nature. And of course, remembering the victims, the people whose lives were changed forever by what happened in LA. Well, that wraps up our deep dive on Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, proof that sometimes real life is scarier than any horror movie. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and hey, maybe sleep with the lights on tonight.